So today is Super Bowl Sunday, or the superb owl, as one of my UU colleagues calls it, the superb owl. The Super Bowl is on our home turf this year at the other end of the bay, closer to where I live in Santa Clara. Some consider the Super Bowl to be the epitome of American communal rituals, a prime example of what sociologist Emil Durkheim called rituals of collective effervescence, an experience of shared excitement, joy, and connection that creates a temporary but powerful sense of solidarity and unity among those gathered, kind of like that song did, right? Now, I had experiences of collective effervescence being in the streets this week in preparation for the Super Bowl, in preparation for the federal law enforcement, crowds that were coming. So that was where my collective effervescence came from this week. But the Super Bowl does indeed have that quality. And how fitting then that Lady Gaga, stick with me, that Lady Gaga has prepared a release of her own version of another American classic, Mr. Rogers' Won't You Be My Neighbor, which will be aired, I believe, as a commercial or as a video during the Super Bowl. So watch Bad Bunny and watch Lady Gaga. I don't really care about the rest of it. That song, Won't You Be My Neighbor, sung by the gentle, soft-spoken man with the red cardigan for over 3 decades on public television, is about kindness, connection, and belonging. Mr. Rogers' show, which I grew up on, was about creating neighborhoods where everyone is valued and everyone belongs. Remember?
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?
We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. Again, the wording of our value of equity. Richard gave us an excellent description of the relationship between justice and equity, that equity is justice compounded, and that equity comes into play when injustices become structural or systemic. The structural and systemic part is what makes equity such a divisive and hot topic, because many people, including many liberals, resist the idea that things like racism and white supremacy are built into our institutions. They instead focus on individual beliefs and behaviors, arguing that if I don't believe in the superiority of white people or actively discriminate against people of color, I am free of racism. Viewed through an individualistic lens, racism can be blamed on those bad white supremacists over there. Not our problem, right? Now, hopefully, not so many of you in here Think that because you have been working on dismantling white supremacy culture and educating yourselves for years now, and you have an active and fabulous dismantling white supremacy culture group, and you are welcome to join any of their events or the committee itself. A similar individualistic logic blames people of color for the effects of racism, of course, when we don't look at systems and structures that perpetuate bias, discrimination, and equity. It's easy to conclude that those who come out on top simply earned it. The problem is that's just not how things work in an interdependent world. We're all embedded in systems and structures much larger than ourselves. We are shaped by these systems and structures, and we can, in turn, shape them. Once we learn to see how injustices are compounded in systems and become structural, as Richard put it, we understand that it's not just attitudes that need to change or individuals, but institutions too, including our congregations. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. Back to Mr. Rogers and the Super Bowl. This week, in the lead up to the Super Bowl, interfaith networks in the Bay Area launched a Won't You Be My Neighbor campaign to support immigrant community members in the face of increased federal law enforcement presence in the area. Nearly 2.5 million immigrants call the Bay Area home. But as we know, many do not feel safe or welcome in their neighborhoods right now. And it's not only immigrants. Anyone with a marginalized identity and anyone who faces systemic barriers to equal access is at risk right now. We heard that from Catholic Charities, right? How many of us are impacted by the cuts in federal funding? Because the people controlling our federal government are seeking to eradicate diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI for short. They seek to eradicate not only what they call woke ideology, social justice, critical race theory, DEI frameworks, all the lenses that help us identify and address the realities of systemic inequalities. They also seek to eradicate the very existence of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Trump regime is actively trying to make this country less diverse, less equitable, and less inclusive. To succeed, they will have to turn us against everything that Mr. Rogers was trying to teach us about being good neighbors and creating communities of belonging. And that is why so many faith leaders are out in the streets right now, putting our bodies on the line across the country. Not just because of Mr. Rogers, but because the very core of who we are and what we are about as people of faith and moral conscience is under direct attack, and the clock is ticking. Experts who study authoritarian and fascist regimes are very clear. The United States is not currently being run as a democracy. In that sense, it is no longer a democracy right now. It's not too late to reverse the shift to authoritarianism, though, but the window is short. Last week, UU ministers from across North America gathered for a conference that happens every 4 years called the Institute for the Learning Ministry, because we recognize we are never done learning. Hundreds were in person in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and hundreds more were online. Like me, I was online. We were all looking forward to hearing from the UUA president, Reverend Dr. Sophia Bettencourt. At the time she was scheduled to speak to us, however, she was being arrested in our nation's capital, along with other faith leaders, for protesting additional funding to the already massively bloated amount of money going to federal immigration enforcement. So instead of hearing from our UUA president, we UU ministers got trained in non-compliance. I'm not the only one preaching about the authoritarian window this morning. Before her arrest in the Capitol Rotunda, Reverend Sophia said, "From slave patrols to ICE and the Department of Homeland Security targeting our neighbors, all people of faith and conscience must resist the structures of empire, fascism, and tyranny. We will do everything in our power to end the desecration and to restore the soul of this nation." This is not a matter of confusing politics and religion, although some will see it this way. Rather, this is a matter of religious leaders, religious people, doing exactly what it is we are called to do. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. For those of you familiar with the UU principles, the equity value statement in the new UUA covenant is a combination of the first and second principles: inherent worth and dignity of every person, and number 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. This language flows out of our liberal religious theological heritage. Our Unitarian and Universalist forebears rejected the Orthodox Calvinist notion of original sin, human depravity, and eternal damnation. They adopted instead a more positive view of both God and human nature, reclaiming the older biblical idea that humans are made in the image of God, imago Dei. Our UU forebears affirmed that all people have inherent worth and dignity, and we all possess the capacity to grow in likeness to God, as Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing famously put it in 1828. We all have the capacity to grow in likeness to God. We are also heirs to the Universalist theology of collective salvation. Universalists like Hosea Ballou insisted that every single one of us is loved by God and saved by that love from damnation. God's expansive love leaves no one out, no one behind. Thus, our task is to try to love similarly as best we can. We are to work together to create conditions of this kind of radically inclusive love right here on earth, in our own neighborhoods and our own congregations. In our UU tradition, working for equity and inclusion is part of a faithful life. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. There is a narrative out there, mostly but not exclusively in right-wing circles, that diversity, equity, and inclusion is trendy, an intellectual fad, mere political correctness. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Equity might be a relatively new word for some of us, but what it refers to, at least as a UU value, is actually pretty simple and ancient. So don't let the word throw you off. Many of the people attacking DEI right now are conservative Christians, MAGA evangelicals, which is really just bizarre if you think about it, because Jesus welcomed everyone to the table. I recently saw a Facebook post that said Jesus is God's director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Indeed. How anyone can read the Christian Gospels and miss that message is beyond me. Jesus was constantly reaching out to people who were marginalized, to poor people, to foreigners, to people with disabilities, to people of oppressed groups. He preached about equity often, about leveling the playing field, even reversing the power structures. In the kingdom of God that Jesus heralded, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus defines his own mission by reading the words of the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, recovery to sight for the blind, and freedom for the oppressed. And that, according to the gospel stories, is what Jesus did in his public ministry. And what matters about Jesus for Unitarian Universalists is what Jesus did, how he lived, how he modeled love of neighbor, how he put his body on the line for the vision of beloved community, as we call it now. Now, equity does not mean that we must miraculously restore sight for those who are blind, but it does mean that we work to ensure equal access for those without sight. It means paying attention to the unique needs of each person, including ourselves. What does each one need in order to access what should be available to all, to participate equally in community life? What are the barriers to full inclusion that currently exist, and how can we eliminate those barriers so everyone has a chance to thrive, and so that we can thrive collectively because the two are connected? These are important questions to ask ourselves here at UUCSR. What barriers exist here for full accessibility and inclusion? What barriers exist for people with disabilities, for trans and non-binary people, for low-income and poor people, for people of color, for people without college degrees, for English language learners, for neurodivergent people? How open are we to hearing what's not working for whom and why? How safe do people feel to share what they need in order to access our programs and contribute their gifts? How often do we look around the table when decisions are being made and ask ourselves, who's missing from the conversation? How much more vibrant and resilient would we be as a community if everyone who wanted to be included really was included? And I think we are a vibrant and resilient community, but how much more of that would we be? We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists haven't always lived up to our theology or our values. Making progress toward racial and economic equity has been a particularly fraught challenge for us. The dominant culture in Unitarian Universalism is white, middle to upper middle class, and highly educated. For those who share this culture, it isn't always easy to see its particularities or its presence, how it privileges some experiences, contributions, and people over others. And while those of us with the dominant culture identities might think that we are being open and welcoming, and we surely want to be, we often unknowingly enforce dominant cultural norms and expectations. These norms and expectations get built into our institutions, into our policies, into the way that we do things. And this creates systemic or structural barriers for people who don't fit the norms. And this is where it becomes an issue of equity. Our UU institutions, our congregations, are not yet level playing fields. We have a ways to go to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities where all can thrive. And it's okay. We're not expected to be perfect. As a well-known quote from the Jewish Talmud puts it, we are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are we free to abandon it. Unitarian Universalism demands that we simply keep at it. The work of building equitable and inclusive communities is holy work, and it's ongoing. It passes from generation to generation. Just like in our country and in the world at large, progress is made and unmade and then made again. Remembering the long arc of history is a crucial part of the struggle, so we don't give up. In terms of what's happening in this country, we have been here before, my friends, and what I mean by we is people spanning generations and traditions who believe that we love God by loving our neighbors, by honoring the dignity and worthiness of each person, and by creating communities of true belonging. As a people, we have been here before, history erased, truth denied, entire groups of people scapegoated and persecuted, oligarchs and tyrants consolidating power, communities occupied by force, families separated, neighbors disappeared, hard-won progress violently unraveled. How generations before us have survived, how people in Minneapolis are surviving, and how we will survive too, is by rooting into our most deeply held values, strengthening our networks of solidarity, protecting the most vulnerable among us, and using our resources to build and sustain accessible and inclusive communities that leave no one behind.